Hello YouTube. I have been asked to continue bringing information forward about the so-called time machine experiments in the former Soviet Union and about cases of instant disappearance of people and related. So I looked at the files that I had collected, and I will tell you a few more interesting cases. Back in the 1970s, Soviet magazine Nauka и Жизнь, or Science and Life, ventured to publish statistics of people who disappeared without a trace. Although, of course, according to foreign data and in foreign countries, this could have ended poorly for the editors because the Soviet regime in charge of the socialist utopia had very rigid ideological censorship. Anyway, the numbers were quite frightening. In countries such as England, France, and Italy, the number of people who disappeared without a trace was from 5 to 20,000 people a year. With the advent of glasnost, Gorbachev's policies of more openness in the USSR, similar data was published in that country. On the territory of the former USSR, up to 85,000 people per year disappeared. And the reasons for the disappearance could be identified only in about 60,000 people. So here's one such case. In 1987, Soviet media reported the loss of a small amateur expedition from the city of Tomsk. The expedition embarked in search of the mysterious Devil's Lair, a clearing with bare ground where all living things died. However, the true story of the missing expedition was revealed not that long ago. There was one girl in the group, two guys were from Novosibirsk. It was assumed that at the point where the group would get off the train, it would be joined by two local enthusiasts. All the young people were experienced, what we call in the Soviet Union, tourists, hikers, mountaineers, and so forth. They had trekked through the Siberian taiga more than once, had firearms and signaling devices with them. In Tomsk, they boarded a train, and according to the train crew, all got off the train safely at the intended location. And then the oddities began. Two local enthusiasts or fans who were supposed to join the expedition were told that the train from Tomsk was 3 hours late, and they went home to wait out this time. But the train engineer reduced the delay to 2 hours, and when the local fans came back to the station, the train had already left. No one saw the guys who arrived from Tomsk. The station attendant said something unintelligible, like some guys got off the train, but where they went to is unknown. A telegram sent to Tomsk a day later was answered that the group had left exactly at the appointed time. Unfortunately, the police joined the search only after 3 days, when the individuals who could see the young people had already left the area. No one saw them anywhere else. It seemed that the group disappeared immediately after leaving the train. Now, let us pay attention to the fact that rare instances of such disappearances confirmed by witnesses occur almost instantly, without any sound or light effects. But is such a phenomenon or miracle in nature is possible in principle? Well, let us turn to the book of Gurevich and Gliner titled General Relativity After Einstein, published in the USSR in 1972. Its authors claim that in reality there are theoretically unavoidable special points at which bodies either appear or disappear from the world around us. Let us look at some more cases chronologically. In 1936, a group of geologists arrived and began their operations from the village of Yelizaveta near Krasnoyarsk. A few days later, after returning home from one expedition, the geologists saw a completely extinct village. Things in the houses were left untouched. There were two bicycles lying on the main village street. One of the geologists later a professor, doctor of geological and mineralogical sciences, Barsukov, still remembers with a shudder the horror that they experienced when trying to get into a house, the door which was closed from the inside. They had to break the glass, and then it turned out that the door was barricaded from the inside with household utensils. A family of 4 adults and 3 children lived in the house. Well, they were gone. Geologists reported the incident to the local department of the NKVD or KGB, and a car with secret police personnel quickly arrived in the village. However, the investigation was unsuccessful, and the geologists signed a non-disclosure agreement about this case. As Barsukov later said, after a while he was summoned to Moscow, to the NKVD, where he again testified. No one in the world outside of possibly KGB archives knows what happened to the village and its population. Here's a letter sent in 1999 to the Russian magazine Chudesaya Prikhrutyenia, or Wonders and Adventures. It was written by a disabled since childhood, a person by the name of Pyotr Paduyev from the city of Bryansk. At the midnight from March 6 to 7, 1943, the inhabitants of his village, which was on the front lines, were driven out by Germans under escort for evacuation to Germany. He was the last man in the line. They were warned, 2 steps from the formation of the column, you will be shot without warning. In front and behind the column, there was convoy, Nazi Germans with dogs. While the villagers were being driven to the station to be herded or loaded into train cars or cattle cars, he met a prisoner of war named Afonia, a man of about 45 years old. Pyotr told him that he was going to run away, and Afonia tried to dissuade him as best as he could. The front column had already reached the railroad tracks. So that no one would run away, the 5 men of the convoy with the dogs moved away from the column. There was only one German guard with the dog. Obeying some conscious feeling that he should run, Pyotr broke out of the line and followed the departing convoy. He heard Afonia cry out in a low voice, "Petya, come back!" But Pyotr kept walking, not reacting to his cry. When he was already 70 meters from the convoy, Pyotr heard Afonia's heart-rending cry, "Petya, come back, you will be shot." Pyotr saw the convoy with the dog in front of him stop, turn in his direction, and the dog sat on its back and also looked at Pyotr. He knew that his end had come. Waiting for the shot, Pyotr turned 180 degrees, as if to say goodbye to Afonia, and immediately turned back to face the convoy, but there was no convoy in front of him. Not believing his eyes, Pyotr looked around and in the direction of the train in which the villagers were going to be loaded into the cattle car. But it was not there. The train was gone. He didn't know what had happened. But after the war, when Pyotr was working in the Oryol region, a tractor driver to whom he told this strange story looked at Pyotr in surprise. "Was it really you? Our train was delayed for 2 hours. Everyone was looking for some guy, but then they said that he was shot trying to escape." Well, here's another case. In the summer of 1973, 3 Leningrad students traveled to the Crimea. On the train, they met 2 girls who were going there as well. In Simferopol, after getting off the train, they agreed that they all would meet at the trolleybus and go together to Yalta. But the girls waited in vain. The guys never showed up. And only after returning to Leningrad, one of them learned from her friend that at the institute where she studied, 3 students who had gone to the Crimea had disappeared without a trace. The signs matched, and the girl went to the police. The young men were a memorable group. They were wearing cowboy hats, they had a guitar, they were noisy and boisterous. 2 young men were athletes trained in martial arts, and they simply vanished. Maybe they too were lost in time. In other cases, once a resident of Moscow had guests over, the conversation dragged on, the cigarettes ran out, and the host excused himself, put on his jacket, and in his slippers went down to the food store, which was located on the ground floor of the same building. But he never showed up at the store, nor did he return home. No trace of the missing host could ever be found. This old idea of the circle of time is taking on a new life in the theory of the pulsating universe. It is believed that the currently observed scattering of galaxies may one day be replaced by their reverse motion, and then time will flow backwards, and again it will return to its normal course, only with the beginning of the next expansion cycle. Who knows, perhaps past events and the fate of people will come to life in the memory of real clairvoyants and psychics as some shadows of the future. Soviet philosopher Alexander Georgievich Spirkin, a corresponding member of the USSR Academy of Sciences, believed that dialectical materialism could not continue to develop without taking into account paradoxical phenomena. Okay? This is reference to paranormal phenomena. The solution to the mystery of the prophecies that were coming through he saw in the depths of the essence of time. Let's look at who he was. So this was Spirkin, was Soviet and Russian philosopher. He was a specialist in the field that's mumbo jumbo, dialectical and historical materialism. This is Marxist BS. Philosophical problems of psychology and cybernetics. Okay, cybernetics was a subject that was forbidden under Stalin. Only in later years they had enough brains to implement research of cybernetics in the USSR. He was Doctor of Philosophy and professor from 1970, corresponding member of the USSR Academy of Sciences in the Department of Philosophy since 1974. Anyway, in 1941 he graduated from the Moscow State Pedagogical Defectological Institute. Now, from July to November 1941, he was engaged on the labor front near Smolensk. They helped the acting army who were fighting Nazis by doing support work. According to the fabricated case, he was arrested by the KGB for espionage. Allegedly, Spirkin was arrested for the careless phrase, "Only the German planes are above us," meaning that the Soviet aircraft were not present to fight them. Now, Spirkin himself indicated in his memoirs that he was put in prison on the denunciation of a neighbor for saying that Stalin is a cruel man. In 1941-1945, he was imprisoned and rehabilitated, meaning he got his good name back, only in 1957. But in 1945 through 1946, he worked as a researcher at the Institute of Neurology of the USSR Academy of Medical Sciences. This was not at all a common case for someone persecuted by the Soviet regime to become a scientist after the end of the prison term. So there is something unusual about his case, and something unusual actually about this person. In 1946-1952, he became a researcher at the Institute of Philosophy of the USSR Academy of Sciences. Now, the doctoral dissertation in 1959 is devoted to the problems of the origin of consciousness. In 1962-68, he was the chairman of the section of philosophical problems of cybernetics of the Scientific Council on Cybernetics under the Presidium of the USSR Academy of Sciences, very close to the government. And in 71-75, he was vice president of the Philosophical Society of the USSR. Now, here's what's interesting. In 1982, he gave an almost 4-hour lecture on parapsychology at Moscow State University, where he argued that the aura is radiation generated by a living system, that after a person leaves, probably dies, there is a framework of his biofield, the aura, and much can be said about it. And this popularized the names and promoted activities of such famous Soviet psychics as Davitashvili, Kulagina, and Kulishova. In 1979-1984, he headed the bioinformatics laboratory at the Popov Society for Radio Engineering, Electronics, and Communications. That's, by the way, where the UFO, one of the semi-official UFO research programs, took place in the USSR too. Now, we just don't know the extent of knowledge of these people and some of the episodes of his somewhat strange life, but to be talking about subjects like that under Soviet regime was detrimental to one's career, but yet he did. But let's look. If you look at my videos, you will find one about the strange mirrors of Kozyrev. Well, he had a non-trivial approach to finding out the nature of time, and it was proposed by him, by this Leningrad scientist, astrophysicist Nikolai Alexandrovich Kozyrev. You can see my video about his strange experiments. All his life he thought about the reason for the luminosity of the sun and stars, and came to a stunning conclusion about the impact on the energy of the celestial bodies of the current flow of time. Moreover, Nikolai Alexandrovich considered the possibility of the influence of the future on the present through the physical properties of time, which in his opinion would explain the phenomenon of foresight. Connections through time should be instantaneous, the scientist argued. This is the only reason why the universe is a whole and not a collection of individual aggregates. With very subtle experiments, Kozyrev seems to have recorded the flow of time from the future to the present. On this basis, he made a startling conclusion. The future is already sealed. To some extent, we have received proof of the existence of fate, because everything is already there. However, fate, according to Kozyrev, is not a supernatural predestination. On the contrary, what is meant is the natural correlation of the past, present, and future. Specifically, the correlation. Therefore, the scientists noticed a certain smearing of the future within which you can adjust your fate. Russian scientist and author Valentin Psalomchikov, who writes about the subjects we can call paranormal, described a very interesting research pertaining to the travel to the past. He described attempts of specialists or experts in various fields of knowledge to get information from the past. In particular, with the help of a special photo, the events that took place in the location of where the picture was taken decades ago are recorded. The voices of people after their death are recorded on tape. Unfortunately, the time machine does not yet exist. And some experts say that it is fundamentally impossible. But a person is curious. He or she wants to gaze into his or her past. She or he seeks and finds other ways to circumvent the fundamental principles of causality. If you cannot go back to the past, you can at least try to glance into it. In the early 1990s, the St. Petersburg Scientific Research Center, Consciousness, conducted experiments on the phenomenon of retrocognition, clairvoyance of the past. The researchers proceeded from the assumption that the psychic material essence accumulates the history of past generations in the pedigree of a given person. That is, in a certain sense, the memory of their ancestors that science fiction writers have repeatedly described in their works, well, it's realized. The staff of the center, employees, tried to put this idea into practice. The research was carried out under laboratory conditions in a special shielded chamber. The subject recorded bioelectric activity of the brain, electrologram, pupil movement, and skin galvanic reaction. The duration of the experiment was about 15 to 20 minutes. 10 people were examined. The group consisted of 2 men and 8 women between the ages of 25 and 47. The subjects were physically and mentally healthy. They were representatives of a wide variety of professions: cook, nurse, engineer, economist, teachers. They had no special knowledge in the field of history. The degree of detail of the pictures from the past in all subjects was high, which allowed the data to be subjected to the simplest statistical processing. Moreover, several subjects in the course of the experiment observed repeated patterns. According to the reports of the subjects, the time and geography of the events they observed stretched from the prehistoric times to the 19th century, from Adriatic to Ceylon or Sri Lanka. Let us give an example of the visual picture observed by the first subject. Her initials D.O. A woman in purple clothes, the driver of a chariot, gilded in wheels of 12 spokes, 2 horses, black and white. The woman sits down next to the driver. They drive on, then they get off together. They went to the wall, and the woman opened a wooden door. Behind the door is a pottery maker who makes products from red clay. Before firing of the clay, a part of the surface was sprinkled with salt. The drawing was applied with the juice of the tree like liquid resin. Then they walked through the city, the buildings made of gray stone. Lots of people, bright clothes, mostly white and purple colors, heads all covered in white. In men, the veil is fixed with a twisted handkerchief. In women, it is thrown over the head, covering the face below the eyes. In the bazaar marketplace, coins are in common use. Either a crab or a lobster are depicted on them. The subject believes that this is the North Africa region. The time of the exploit is not determined. During the second experiment, she got to the same place and with the same driver, but only at night. She saw people sleeping. The bedding was in niches in the walls. The time was determined to be as 200 BC. The fragmentary nature of the images is probably due to the short duration of the experiment, 15 to 20 minutes, and unlike ordinary dreams, the events during retrocognition occur in real time. The subject LG during the first session saw 3 pictures in turn. After the second session, she compiled a simple dictionary of the ancient language, which included 40 words. According to her, the scene was Sri Lanka, the southern tip of the island, not far from the sea. She identified the date as 458 BC. The young man who explained to her the meaning of some words was called Lkonkonur Diomitha, and the country was called Zgiusa. During the first session, the subject saw the scenes of the death of the Lokonur. He died during a duel with another young man. Both were naked to the waist and fought with bone daggers with strongly curved blades. They both circled, trying to strike first. A large crowd had gathered, in which the culprit of the duel stood out, a dark-skinned girl with her hair in braids. As the sun was setting, Lkonur involuntarily looked towards the sunset, and his opponent stabbed him in the right side with a knife. The duel ended, and the women dressed in light clothes wrapped the body of the dead man in a narrow cloth and then carried him on a stretcher to the cave. During the second session, the subject saw a palace in the rock, the owner of which was Lkonur. He showed her the rooms, the walls of which were decorated with red and brown drawings. The ceiling was vaulted, multifaceted. She remembers the dishes: a large yellow dish with a blue border and a blue center, a cup, a jug. There are weapons on the wall. There were 3 knives. Between these 2 pictures, there was a scene unrelated to them. The subject found herself in a square in Italy in 1630 AD. Later, in an atlas, she identified this place as an area west of Caltagirone in Sicily. On the square, she saw a crowd in which a stout man in red velvet clothes stood out. In general, all clothes were long. People looked at the sky with fear. Something black spilled out. There is smoke above the mountains, a stream between two peaks like water illuminated by the sun. There are flashes among the smoke, and it was dark over the square. Based on the analysis of the self-reports of the subjects, the staff of the Center Consciousness concluded that there is a historical background in some cases. In the course of further experiments, the participation of specialists, historians, would be desirable to verify the details given. Well, similar experiments were conducted in Bulgaria using a similar method, and historians took part in their discussions. Some household items, clothing of the people they met, coins and weapons coincided with the subjectively determined dates of events. Some points for historians were unexpected and controversial. On the other hand, a number of architectural details and even reports about now defunct buildings and monuments made by subjects who have nothing to do with history and archaeology, well, they were confirmed by specialists, by experts. It should be immediately clarified that these experiments are not about reincarnation and the memory of past lives. Most researchers of retrocognition tend to the model of the existence of an information field matrix, a kind of analog of the soul in a person, which is preserved after the death of an individual within a single information field. Simply put, the matrices of all those who live and lived in it exist simultaneously, and thus the experimenter can use special techniques while spontaneously to connect to the matrix memory of long ago, people who lived long ago, and see the events of that era as if through their eyes. Needless to say, if this hypothesis is confirmed, people will open up unprecedented opportunities to travel to the past. And one day I will bring information that Ivan Yefremov presented in his books, but that will be in a future video, and we'll see the correlation. But let's look at a few more examples. On one of the hot summer days in 1997, two friends from garden or nursery enterprise located in the area of Nevsky Dubrovka decided to go for a swim. Anna Virolainen, who was walking first, came to the shore and suddenly staggered. The sunlight faded, replaced by a kind of gray, lifeless illumination, like in a black and white movie. On the Neva River, large boats appeared from somewhere. Soldiers were sitting in them and firing towards the shore, although there was no sounds of shots. And on the shore, almost next to Anna, there was a trench in which soldiers in helmets were sitting, located, and fired at the approaching boats. She felt that the mirage lasted for half a minute, and then it was gone, replaced again by a bright sunny day. Anna sat down weakly on a beach rock. "What's wrong with you? What is it?" asked a friend who came up. "You are all pale. Don't you see anything?" "What was I supposed to see?" replied Anna. "Soldiers, boats." "You overheated, Anna, in the sun," stated her friend. "Go sit in the shade and do not immediately jump into the cold water." Well, on one of the first cases of investigation of the phenomenon, which we will conditionally call the echo of the past, occurred in the late 1970s near Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, and before too. Residents of one of the villages sent a letter to the Voyakova main geophysical observatory so that the staff there would help them deal with a strange, regularly observed phenomenon that manifests itself exclusively at night and does not allow them to sleep normally. The village was several tens of kilometers away from the nearest railway, and at night it seemed to many of its residents that a railway, that a train was passing right in the forest outside the village. They could hear the engine horns, the hiss of a steam, and the clatter of wheels. Sometimes these typical railway sounds were supplemented by the dull sound of artillery firing, although the Rzhev artillery range was located even further away. Of course, in the observatory there were those who wanted to live a quiet, in a quiet village for a while, sleep on the hay and drink fresh milk. So, they decided to investigate. Every Friday, 2 or 3 employees went to the site of these events, strange events, spent Sunday days there, and then returned to the city until the next Friday. Not immediately, but they were lucky. One Saturday night, they clearly heard the clatter of wheels and the engine horns. At first, theories began to talk about refraction and sound waveguides in certain atmospheric conditions, until someone realized, guys, what does steam locomotive have to do with this? They have long since have been removed from the railroads and put into conservation, taken out of service. The situation became even more confusing when some old-timers remembered that during the war, that's Second World War II, railway workers literally laid rails along a forest clearing within a week, and a steam locomotive riding on those rails carried a platform with a large cannon. Apparently, the matter involved railway troops and the railway high-powered artillery, for which a temporary siding was urgently laid. After the war, when every ton of metal was accounted for, the rails were dismantled and taken away, and the low embankment quickly lost its outlines and was overgrown so that in 10 years nothing resembled the railway that once had been laid there. Now, the observed phenomenon has acquired a completely fantastic shape. It turned out that the residents of the village and scientists from the observatory witnessed the sound echo of a long past events. In those years, experts were not yet ready to believe in such an explanation. Already in 1990s, when the numerous public organizations for the study of anomalous phenomena were formed in Russia, fairly stable local zones were discovered where echoes of the past were regularly observed. In St. Petersburg, such a place was the Peter and Paul Fortress, and in Moscow, the area of the Patriarch's Ponds. Here's a small report from a journalist from one of those places. Down a narrow alley, almost unto us, we're standing on the edge of the sidewalk. Just the sound is moving. Otherwise it is impossible to describe it. I can clearly distinguish the calm, even noise from the work of a powerful motor. I can even follow it with my eyes. Now the car is approaching. Now it is almost level with us. Now it has passed us and is driving on. And all this is just one sound. The pavement is empty. Pavement is empty, just as the pavement of a tiny Moscow lane can be empty around 3 o'clock in the morning. Meanwhile, the traffic stopped. An invisible car, it cannot be anything else, stopped at the door of a small mansion. The engine can be heard idling. Then there are things that make you feel cold. The sound of a door opening is heard. Quiet footsteps, a voice saying something. I cannot make out the words. The lock clicks on the car door and it slams shut. The engine revs up. The car starts in half a minute. The last sounds fade into the night. A curious episode of the echoes of the past had to be faced in a case when the echo of the past was witnessed by a large group of completely sober officers of the Russian Far Eastern military, town of Shkotovo 17. At the end of November in 1993, this group returned late at night from the service. The car took the officers to the intersection. The four of them walked to their homes along the sidewalk of Usate Street, discussing the events of the past day. When they reached the Sputnik movie theater, they heard someone catching up with them. They heard the sound of running feet, but he or she was not running on the sidewalk, but on the roadway of the street. The footsteps were rapidly approaching the officers, who were at that moment in the lighted part of the streets and cinema. One of them turned around and shouted loudly, "Look!" From where they were, the street was visible all the way to the end, and against this light background it was clear that the sidewalk and the roadway were completely deserted. The sound of a person running was getting closer, but the officers could see nothing and no one. So this invisible man ran along the road just a few meters from them. The officers standing on the sidewalk felt a chill at that moment, as if something very cold had passed by. For about 2 minutes or more, they could hear the sounds of footsteps receding with the speed of a running man, and then fading away in the distance. All that can be said about the phenomenon of the echo of the past is that in the vast majority of cases, it is observed only at night. It is possible that this is due to the fact that at night the external sound background drops sharply, and the sensitivity of the sound receptors increases. The fact that we are dealing with a very real physical phenomenon is evidenced by the fact that echoes are heard at the same time, if they're not deaf, by observers, and some researchers even managed to record it on magnetic tape and even digital voice recorder chips. But it is still difficult to say anything about the nature of the phenomenon itself, if only because there are only fragmentary observations, but no scientific studies of this phenomenon have been conducted. Let's imagine the following picture. Many thousands of years ago, primitive man watched with fear and trepidation as a flash of lightning struck a tree and the tree caught fire. Having no knowledge of electricity, he could not understand the nature of lightning. And without knowing this, he could not understand the nature of fire. In the same way, modern people are amazed by the stories of people who suddenly and mysteriously disappeared in the presence of numerous witnesses and never returned, or about the echoes of the past and a similar phenomenon. I thank you for your attention. I'll bring you more episodes of the Russian so-called time travel research and disappearances. And if you can support my research, please do so. And there are descriptions in the there are links in the description to this file. And the only reason I hesitate to end is that last night I was with a group of people, and we gathered together, and we still cannot explain, none of us, the sounds very similar to the phenomenon of that running man that were heard in the area where we were sitting, and we became silent because we didn't want to. We wanted to understand what was going on, and out of nowhere came sounds of somebody walking on the floor, but there was nobody there except us, no one. But we heard those sounds for about 5 minutes. It was very interesting, and I cannot describe the phenomenon fully, but it was tremendous. Something I've never heard before. And there were 6 of us, people of all different backgrounds and professions. So there are many wonders in this world, and hopefully we will solve them one day. Thank you for your attention.